this video is, but even for male off, this takes place in 19, so George, that's strange. Anyway. Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Heather and as always I'm reading with a vengeance and I hope you are too. So even though I am recording in the new year, this is my last wrap up of 2023. If you're wondering if I'm going to be doing a favorites of 2023 video, absolutely yes. I'm going to be recording it as soon as I finish recording this video. So if you're watching this, it's coming very soon, probably within a couple of days. I don't really have any life news to report. I think I did most of that in my most recent video, but it is actually the new year. So I will say Happy New Year instead of if it's the new year, Happy New Year. So I hope everybody had a really good New Year's. But even though this video is going to be published in 2024, it's technically the last video of 2023. So I just want to get through it so that we can start fresh in the new year with new content. It's all very, very exciting. But I don't want to diminish the last books that I read in 2023. So let's just get to them. I have 6 books to talk to you about that I read in the second half of December. Sadly, only 2 of them I thought were really great. The other 4 ranged from meh to DNF. But first, stats. I read a total of 10 books in the month of December. I had 1 DNF, which I'm about to talk to you about. 5 male authors, 6 female authors, 4 physical books, and 6 audiobooks. So if you've been watching for a while, you know I don't do a rating system here on my channel, but I do talk about the books in the order of enjoyment from the least to the most. So let's get started with the DNF, which was a shocker for me. This makes me so sad. This book has been on my shelf for years and years, and it got onto my shelf because the movie is one of my all-time favorite movies. It remains one of my all-time favorite movies. And I thought, well, if the movie is one of my favorites, the book is going to be stellar, right? This makes me so sad. The book I'm talking about is A Very Long Engagement by Sébastien Japresseau. That's my attempt at French. Anyway, this was translated by Linda Coverdale. And this is a tricky thing because I know that phrase lost in translation, it's a real thing. And I know that there are some translations of the same book that are better than others. I don't read a whole lot of translations, so I can't really comment a whole lot about that. All I can say is, unfortunately, this book was just too slow. It was too boring. The wittiness didn't come through. At least maybe I didn't get far enough into it. It was one of those books that I wasn't thinking about all day when I wasn't reading. I kind of dreaded picking it up, and I just wasn't going to force myself to read a book that I wasn't enjoying just because I loved the movie. So it just makes me sad because I was really thinking that I was going to have a complete love affair with this book, and it just didn't happen for me. Just a quick synopsis. This opens up in 1917. We are in World War I in France. There are 5 soldiers who are being punished for self-mutilation to try to get sent home. And the way that they're punished is they are forced into the enemy lines. And what they do afterwards is completely up to them. This whole event is hush-hushed by the military. Meanwhile, you're following Matilda, a young woman who sets out to investigate what happened to the love of her life, who just so happens to be one of these 5 soldiers. And she just goes on this quest to find out what happened to him. And you follow her as she talks to multiple people, in addition to following her struggle because she has been unable to walk since she was a child. And ultimately, it is this love story wrapped in a mystery. I wouldn't discourage anybody from reading this per se because, of course, I went into it slightly biased. Maybe I didn't like the writing style. Maybe just the pacing was off for me. I don't know. I can tell you the story is fantastic. If you want to just skip to it, I highly, highly recommend the movie. It is subtitled. I wouldn't discourage you from trying this book if the story appeals to you. It didn't work out for me, sadly. It was the tragedy of December 2023. Silver Lining is a book that's been on my shelf for years and years and years that now can be donated to a little free library. The next book I read was Resting Scrooge Face. So I added this to my TBR probably way back in the summer. I came across it as one of the freebies on Audible, and I saved it thinking that this would be a fun one to read around Christmas time. So I read it. It's a short story. It's only about 80 pages long. It's only a little over an hour to listen to. And really, it's a Hallmark holiday movie in the written form with less quality. If I didn't mention, this is written by Megan Quinn. And to be fair, if you've watched my channel for a while, you know that romance isn't my go-to genre. I don't have anything against it. It just doesn't quite work for me. I like a good love story, but romance, yeah, it just doesn't work for me. And so I should have known better, but I just thought it would be fun and cute to read at Christmas time. And that's what I did. But basically, you have Nola, who is a Scrooge, and she goes back to her hometown for reasons, and she is dreading running into Caleb, I believe his name is, who never left the little town. Years ago, he broke her heart. And the way the story plays out is Caleb ends up writing, I think, a letter, but more it's like a journal entry about how much he hates Christmas. But he ends up throwing it away. And his friend, or it might even be an uncle, finds the letter, knows Nola is in town and knows about their past, and somehow gets this note sent to Nola. And Nola, seeing this anonymous note, feels a kinship towards this other Scrooge, and she ends up writing back, even though she doesn't know who she's writing to. And she gives this note to the same guy who gave her Caleb's note, and they end up doing this pen pal thing, anonymous pen pal thing, through Caleb's uncle, until they finally realize, gosh, you know, I'm kind of liking Christmas. What do you say we get together and celebrate together? And oh, it's you. Oh, it's you. Oh, I've loved you all along. No. It was just silly. It was light. It's a short story. I can't really be too harsh about it because it wasn't meant to have that much depth. I think what I thought the appeal for me was going to be was the Scrooginess of it, because I can be somewhat Scroogey around Christmas time. Just ask my husband. But anyway, it's not a book that I expected to love, but I gave my reasons for reading it. It added to my Goodreads reading challenge. Silver lining again. Next book I read was Call for the Dead by Jean Le Carré. Yes, another book that I normally wouldn't pick up. Let me tell you my reasons behind this. So there was a movie that came out a few years back called Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy that I was very interested in seeing. Do I like spy movies? Well, if it's not Mission Impossible or James Bond, not really. But I love Gary Oldman, so I wanted to see this movie. And for whatever reason, years went by and I never saw it. And then I discovered it's the adaptation of a book by Jean Le Carré. And then I discovered that it's the 5th in the series. So I thought, of course I want to read the book first. And of course I want to read the series in order. So, Call for the Dead is the first in the George Smiley series, and George Smiley works as a British special operative. This was an audiobook for me. Of course, this is an introduction to our main character, George Smiley. Like I said, he's a British Secret Service, and in this story, he is assigned to interview Foreign Office man who was being investigated for communist activities. This series opens up in the 1950s, I believe. Anyways, the interview is somewhat of a technicality. Nobody believes that he really did anything wrong, but they need to have everything on paper. So they send George to just do this final interview. Everything goes fine. But the next day, this Foreign Office man is found dead, and it looks like a suicide. And George is blamed for it because the powers that be say, this was supposed to be a technicality. You were supposed to put his mind at ease. What did you say in this interview that would lead him to commit suicide? And George, of course, is completely stymied, and he kind of looks further into it. And the more he investigates it, the more he believes this was a murder instead of a suicide. And the story goes from there. So I found the premise interesting, and I thought it would be really good. And I would say the first 20 minutes were somewhat good. And then it just kind of lost me. It just got very slow. Also, the hierarchy of British government and the inner workings of the British Secret Service just kind of lost it for me. I couldn't follow it. So I guess this is more a me thing. but still I found the pacing quite slow. I probably would have DNF'd this book had it not been so short. It was only 5 hours long, and by the time I realized I was bored with it, I was more than halfway through with it. So when I finished this book, I knew I wasn't going to continue on with the series. And since I knew that, I thought, well, let's just watch the movie. And I DNF'd the movie. Just kind of a bummer. You know, even Gary Oldman wasn't enough to keep me interested in the movie. It was just super slow. Even Tom Hardy is in the book, and he wasn't enough to keep me engaged. Tom Hardy. That was my whole experience with Jean Le Carré and George Smiley espionage series. Again, another one just not for me. If I'm going to give you a recommendation and you love Gary Oldman, watch the show Slow Horses that's on Apple TV. And if you don't have Apple TV, the books, I believe written by Mike Herron. It's a whole series also, which I didn't realize until after I started watching the show. The show is fantastic, and I'm getting way off topic here. Call for the Dead, the George Smiley series, not for me, not moving on with the series. Moving on. Okay, I promise you it just gets better from here. The next book I read was also an audiobook, and I would consider it more a short story, is Address Unknown by Katherine Cressman Taylor. This is definitely worth reading. I want to say it was only an hour audiobook. It's less than 100 pages. It's got a powerful message. But if I'm being honest, I feel like the history behind this book is even more interesting than the book. And I only became aware of this history as I'm listening to the book. It opens up with an introduction by the author's son. And just a little tidbits about it. It first was published in a magazine at the time. It was a huge success. It was originally published under the name Cressman Taylor, and everybody thought it was a man who wrote it. After its success in the magazine, then it was published in book form. Ultimately, it was banned by Nazi Germany. Big surprise. It was a big hit in the United States at the time, and then it went many, many years just kind of under the radar until the recent past. It's kind of reemerged and gained new readership and new success. And I just found the history of this book just really, really fascinating. Now, the book itself, the story itself, is comprised up of letters between a Jewish man who is an art dealer living in San Francisco and his former business partner who has moved back to Germany. And the letters start off innocent enough. How are you doing? How's business? How's the motherland? How's the family? Things like that. And as the power of the Nazis increase in Germany, you can tell the relationship changing between these two men. And it's quite chilling to, of course, like I said, I listened to it to listen to the man living in Germany, how the way he talks to his friend changes. And you can just feel how insidious hate is and how easy it can just creep into the most solid relationships. It's such a short, simple story, but the message is just so powerful, just blind hate and how destructive that can be, and blind nationalism, and how easy it can just destroy an entire people. I definitely recommend this story. It's not for the faint of heart. Even though there's no violence on the page, this story will leave you somewhat exhausted for the simple reason of it actually happened at the time, and another form of it is currently happening. Taylor's conveyance of this topic is, in a word, brilliant. Definitely recommend this short story. Next up, I read Mystic River by Dennis Lehane. I finally read Dennis Lehane. I've been wanting to read him for a very long time. I'm pretty sure I wanted to read Dennis Lehane ever since I saw Mystic River when the movie came out in theaters years ago. I want to say it's a 20-year-old movie. It was directed by Clint Eastwood. It got a couple of Oscar awards for acting. It's got an incredible cast. I absolutely loved the movie. I want to rewatch it. And the book did not disappoint. In fact, it was very interesting. They did a really, really good job of adapting the book because they're almost exact. There's even a couple of conversations that are verbatim from the book in the movie. The story follows three friends, Jimmy, Sean, and Dave. When they were kids, they were all playing in the street one day when a car drives up and two men who claim to be police officers makes Dave get in the car, and he's gone for 4 days. Turns out those men were not police officers. Dave was sexually assaulted, but he ultimately escaped. And of course, he is never the same again, and the relationship between the three boys is never the same again. Then cut 25 years later, we have Dave, who is married. He has a son of his own. He's living a relatively quiet life in the same neighborhood. Then you have Jimmy, who is an ex-con, but now he runs a popular convenience store in the neighborhood. He's happily married. He's got 3 daughters. And then you have Sean, who is a detective with the state police. All 3 men, they know each other, obviously, but they're not really friends anymore. And then one day, something happens that makes all 3 of their lives collide again. Jimmy's oldest daughter, Katie, is found murdered. On the same night, Dave comes home very late after a night of drinking with blood on his hands, and he tells his wife a very unlikely story of what happened. And Sean is tasked with investigating Katie's murder. And the story goes from there. This is an excellent mystery. It doesn't go the way you think it's going to go. There's a pretty good twist to it. There's all kinds of secrets. There's stuff that happens in all 3 men's past that affects the current events that are happening. This talks a lot about the lifelong effects of child sexual abuse, especially when it's coupled with non-communication. Not only is this an extremely compelling story, Lahane's writing style is just right up my alley. I love the pacing of this book. I couldn't put it down. I can't wait to read more of his stuff. I ended up reading this book, even though it's been on my TBR for years. I was kind of forced to read it because it was the December pick for the mystery book club that my bookstore that I work at puts on. So I was super excited to read this one. We had a really great discussion about it. I absolutely loved it. Of course, I highly recommend it. If you've seen and loved the movie, I would recommend the book, especially if it's been a long time since you've seen the movie, because it's equally, if not more, enjoyable. If you've read the book and loved it and you're afraid the movie will ruin it, it won't. Either way, if you haven't read it, read it. If you haven't watched the movie, watch the movie. It was so good. I had such a good time with this book. Would absolutely recommend. Finally, the last book that I read in 2023 is a book that I ended up loving. It's a book that many people love. It's a book that I have had on my TBR since it was published, I think in early 2022. I don't know what took me so long to read this book. I'm so glad I read it, even though it wrecked me. Finally, you guys. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. It's worth the hype, you guys. Finally, a hyped book that is worth the hype. When this book was published, the only thing that was interesting to me was the author, because I read The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry and I absolutely loved it. If you haven't read that one, I highly recommend it. The only thing that interested me about this book, the cover did nothing for me, the title did nothing for me, the synopsis did nothing for me, and that's probably why it took me so long to read this book. And then let's talk about what happened when I started reading it. I started reading it and there's so much about gaming in this book, and I am not a gamer, you guys. Well, I wasn't. I'll get to that in a minute. And that's the thing that brings the 2 main characters together, Sam and Sadie. Really quickly, if you're one of the 3 people left on the planet who hasn't read this book, Sam is in the hospital as a young boy. I want to say he's 11 or 12. He's been in a terrible car accident and he's in the hospital for a long time for a severe injury to his foot. He doesn't talk to anybody. All he does is play video games. And then Sadie meets him because her sister Alice is in the hospital recovering from cancer. So Sadie and Sam meet each other. They have an equal love for video games, and that's how they bond and connect and become friends. But then something happens and they get into this big fight and they go like 6 years without talking to each other. And then they run into each other again as they are students in college. Sadie's going to MIT, Sam's at Harvard. They reconnect and they decide to create a video game. And so they go into business together, they become friends again, they become successful together, and the story goes from there. This is a love story at its purest form. The realness of these two characters was 100% spot on. I loved Sadie and I hated her. I loved Sam and I hated him. There's also a third main character who's pretty important. His name is Marks. He starts off as Sam's friend and roommate, and the business that Sadie and Sam go into together ends up being kind of a business that includes all three of them. He ends up becoming a producer of their first video game. And while we're talking about Marks, there was no hate for Marks. I loved Marks. I loved everything about him. But like I said, going into this, I was nervous because of the hype. And then as I started reading it, at the beginning, there was a lot of technical talk about gaming and the gaming community and games themselves. And I thought I wasn't really going to like it. But then you get to know Sam and Sadie and they're dynamic and you are sucked in. And all of a sudden, I found myself not wanting to put this book down. I felt completely connected to the characters. I cared about them. Both Sam and Sadie were just so relatable to me. There were times where you absolutely loved Sadie, but there were times where you're seriously annoyed with her. However, the things that made her annoying were just so real. I just felt like she was a real person. And the same thing with Sam. Sometimes he could be a complete dick, but then you felt like you knew where he was coming from. These characters were just brilliantly written. And then you just get into the complexities of friendship and going into business with a friend. And then Zevin goes deeper into the things that affect us as individuals, not only as individuals, but just globally as well, like chronic illness or chronic pain, how that could not only change our lives on a day-to-day basis, but it can change our personalities. She also gets into how women are viewed, and not just from the misogynistic point of view, which of course she does get into a little bit, but just on the norm, how it's assumed that even though Sam and Sadie are equal in creating this very successful game, most of the gaming male-dominated community assumes that this was Sam's brainchild. So I thought she handled that very well. I liked how she dealt with failure and how failure affects us and how we should react to failure and how we only get better if we fail more often. There was so much in this book that was just so meaningful and so important. I really ended up loving this book. I do have a couple of, well, I don't tab my books. I usually write notes in my little journal. So I have a couple of, looks like quotes. Let me see. Yes. When Sadie is talking about failure, she's talking about how she thought after their huge success that they had with the first video game that they created, she thought that she would never fail again. Says she thought that she had arrived, but life was always arriving. There was always another gate to pass through. Until, of course, there wasn't. Just a super powerful point. And this next quote that I want to read to you, it's really only going to be more meaningful if you read the book, but still I find it powerful and relevant to life. Just as context, Sadie, she doesn't have a hard time saying the words "I love you" to people that she loves, but Sam has a really hard time for reasons. And then towards the end of the book, some stuff has happened. And this is an inner dialogue that Sam is having. And he says, why wouldn't you tell someone you loved them? Once you loved someone, you repeated it until they were tired of hearing it. You said it until it ceased to have meaning. Why not? Of course you goddamn did. Amen to that, right? If you love somebody, tell them. And finally, this last quote I want to share because it's so encapsulated something that I've felt before as a 50-something-year-old woman, as a Generation Xer, and it just was a powerful way to put it. So I just have to share it with you. And it's really Sam and Sadie having a conversation. This generation doesn't hide anything from anyone. My class talks a lot about their traumas and how their traumas inform their games. They, honest to God, think their traumas are the most interesting thing about them. I sound like I'm making fun, and I am a little, but I don't mean to be. They're so different from us, really. Their standards are higher. They call bullshit on so much of the sexism and racism that I, at least, just live with. But that's also made them kind of, well, humorless. I hate people who talk about generational differences like it's an actual thing, and here I am doing it. And Sam says, if their traumas are the most interesting things about them, how do they ever get over any of it? Just super powerful stuff. This book was brilliantly written. If you don't both love and hate Sam and Sadie, are you even alive? Like I said, to the 3 people who perhaps haven't read this yet and you're afraid that it's overhyped, it's not. It's worth the hype. And I almost forgot to mention, I wasn't a gamer before I read this book, and I'm still not a gamer, but now I'm interested to find a video game that I would enjoy. And evidently there are games out there that don't necessarily involve shooting or killing things. There are video games that are all about the story and the narration and characters, and I'm on the hunt to find one. And if I find one, I'm going to share it with you guys. If it's not clear already, I absolutely love this book. I sobbed my eyes out at the end of it. Sobbed, 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 to the point my husband looked at me and said, "Are you crying?" Loved it. Please read it. That is it. Those are the books that I read in the second half of December. Those are the last books that I read in 2023. How did you guys end your year? I hope it ended with a bang. I think mine sure did, because I read the very last page of the very last book on December 31st. And that's how you should go out, right? Anyways, what books did you guys end the year with? Have you read any of these books? What did you think about them? Please let me know, or you can just say hi down in the doodly-doo. If you're still watching at this point, please consider giving that like button a boop, and a subscribe would be great. And I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.